Hello and welcome to the MESAM podcast. This is the podcast where we talk to MESAM members and associates about their recent or ongoing research into the medieval world of Central Europe. I'm Karen Culver, and today I'm back in Vienna and very happily meeting with Lena Sadovski to talk about her work on the persistence of Jewish otherness amongst the new Christians of Spalato, integration, persecution and trade. Lena studied history and Romance philology at the University of Vienna, where she received her PhD in 2023 with a thesis on the social structure of Dalmatian town of Spalato between Venetian dominion and Ottoman menace, 1479 to 1525. From 2016 to 24, she was a student assistant and then a visiting researcher at the Institute for Medieval Research of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Since 2025, Lena is the Apart GSK Fellow at the Academy's Balkan Studies Research Unit with an habilitation project on Catholicism in Ottoman Bulgaria in the 17th and 18th century. Her current research focuses on the history of southeastern Europe in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, especially Dalmatia and Bulgaria. Her book, Venice and the Dalmatian Hinterland, was published by Brill in early 2025. Lena tells me she loves travelling, which is really good because she has to travel a lot for her research and to attend and present papers to many conferences. And she also says in each city she goes to, she collects the lapel pin, which shows a feature of the city. She's collected them from Key West to Oslo and has over 40 already. It's a pretty good collection.
Yes, it is.
Lena, welcome to the MESAM podcast.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good, I'm glad. You're researching the new Christians working between Dalmatia, mainly Spalato, nowadays Split, and Apulia. Please, just to set us off on the right track, who were they, and did their community have a clear and legal definition?
Yes, so the term New Christians, Cristiani Novi or Cristiani Novelli in Latin or Italian, generally denotes people, mostly Jews, who converted to Christianity themselves or whose ancestors had converted to Christianity. The community of the Apulian New Christians that I have worked on in the 15th century were the descendants of Jews who had converted in 1292, so more than 200 years earlier. However, being Jewish was not just a question of religion, but also of social, political, and legal status. And this means that the New Christians stayed a separate community even after conversion because they were categorized in a special fiscal status between Christians and Jews. And in some towns in Apulia, especially Trani, Barletta, and Manfredonia, they also constituted a separate legal and social community between the nobility and the commoners. So this was legally classified also in the statutes of these towns. Moreover, most of these new Christians were active as merchants, and which is why by the 15th century their denomination became simply mercatores or mercanti. So they were just identified as the merchants per se.
And presumably that separation was also there in Spalato.
Yes, although not in that legal sense. So many of these Apulian New Christians had to leave their hometowns in the second half of the 15th century because there was a very difficult time for Apulia with the French invasions of Italy. And in these times of war and of lacking central power, many people started to look for scapegoats. And very often these scapegoats, not just in Italy, but everywhere, as we know, were Jews and also these new Christians, although they had been born as Christians for generations already. And so in this in this climate of persecution, of mistrust, many people also trying to get rid of their creditors. The new Christians were not just merchants, but in many cases also moneylenders. Many of them decided to leave Apulia, and they went to Venice, Ragusa, the Ottoman Empire, and also Dalmatia. In Dalmatia, we see that they continue to constitute a separate community. So we see that they married among each other. There's a strong tendency towards endogamy. They cooperated with each other when they did business. And the sources also continue to call them or to identify them as coming from Apulia and as being merchants, even when they had lived in Dalmatia already for several decades. However, their religious difference is not mentioned in the sources during the first decades of living in Dalmatia. So it seems that this didn't really play a role, unless in times of conflict.
You said they had a special fiscal status, so they were taxed differently?
Exactly. So after the initial conversion in the late 13th century, the authorities wondered what to do with these people now. They didn't want to acknowledge them as just like the old Christians, like everyone else in the society, but they also weren't Jews anymore. So they created this special fiscal category, and the people had to pay taxes between those that the Christians had to pay and between the increased amount that the Jews had to pay. And that is why they maintained this difference. And they stayed visible as a different community, which then was also strengthened through their endogamic marriage practices, through their collective focus on being merchants and also moneylenders. And then eventually it led to them becoming a third social class alongside the nobility and the commoners, so that also in the city councils, these councils were constituted of, I think, 6 noblemen, 2 commoners, and 2 of these new Christians.
Is that Apulia?
That is in Apulia right now.
And in Dalmatia?
In Dalmatia, we don't see this different fiscal or legal status. So there, the fact that they remained a different community was rather based on their geographic origin and on their focus on being merchants. So the Dalmatian societies continued to identify them as Apulians and as merchants, sometimes also calling them only Apulian merchants, even if they had been living in towns like Spalato for a couple of decades. However, some very rare sources do show that the memory of their Jewish background persisted, and in conflict, this memory could also be articulated explicitly and weaponized against them to discredit them.
So we're talking about societies where the Jews were differentiated themselves. And yet the Venetians seems to have been more pragmatic towards the new Christians. Why was this?
Well, in Dalmatia, the sources show us that the Apulian new Christians could settle and integrate themselves into the society in general without any problems. The Croatian State Archive of Zadar, for instance, contains hundreds of import and export licenses that were granted to New Christian in Spalato, and they are mentioned in many other sources. So we are sure that they could live there and work there without many problems. However, at the same time, Venice also clearly demonstrates a hostility towards Jews and towards converts. The Venetians mostly called them Marani, which was the most common term also used on the Iberian Peninsula. So, for instance, in 1497, the Venetian Senate issued a formal decree of expulsion aimed against all Marani living in its territories. However, since these Marani were well-connected merchants, they were very important for the economy of the Republic, and that is why this decree of expulsion was not executed to a large extent and had to be proclaimed a second time in 1550. Moreover, Venice also did not persecute or arrest Jews or Marani on inquisitorial grounds, as Spain famously did with the Spanish Inquisition. And we also see that Venice in general did not stop them from passing through or from settling in its Greek colonies, for instance in Corfu, as long as the number of newcomers wasn't too high. For Dalmatia, we have a very interesting source from 1495 from the island of Lesina, Hvar in Croatian, which is very close to Spalato. There, the Venetian governor of Lesina asked the Senate what he should do with some 40 families of Jews and Marani who were coming to his island from Apulia. And the Venetians said that these Jews and the Marani should not be disturbed in any way, and their possessions also should not be touched. However, they were not allowed to stay and should continue their journey as soon as possible. So we see that the Venetians didn't persecute them, but they also didn't want them to stay in Dalmatia. But as I've said, the sources clearly show that many new Christians could settle in Dalmatia and do their business there and integrate into the society. And I think that that was possible not because the Venetians did not know who these people were, but because they fulfilled a useful and necessary role for the town. That is, they provided it with necessary goods, especially with grain. The Dalmatian towns were very dependent on grain imports at that time, so as long as they fulfilled this useful role, Venice didn't touch them and was happy to have them there.
So you mean the Venetians would say publicly they should all leave, but actually not implement it?
Well, they were pragmatic merchants.
Yes, they were very, very pragmatic. You've talked about sources and archives and export-import licenses, but it presumably was just the name. How come you're aware that these people were Marano, New Christians, or Jewish?
That is an excellent question. I could identify them in my sources from Dalmatia mostly through their family names, which in many cases are quite unique. And I initially became aware that these people were living and working in Spalato when I started to read a bit more about Apulia, because these commercial contacts between Dalmatia and Apulia were very visible in the sources. And then I came across a book by Benjamin Scheller about the new Christians of the Apulian town Trani. And when reading it, I recognized several names. I thought, I know this surname. It's a quite unique name. And then I checked, and then I recognized even more names and more names. And then in the end, more than 20 family names were familiar to me from Spalato. And then I also saw that these families actually originated from Trani, Barletta, or Manfredonia. And that is how I could identify these people.
What sort of family names? Can you give some examples?
Well, for instance, Minadoi or Barisano or Capuano. In some cases, it's a bit more tricky to identify them if the last name is deriving from a first name, like Robertis. So there you cannot be very sure. But when you see the combination of first name and last name, and that they are related to many other of these new Christians, and that they were also active as merchants, then you see the pattern and can quite safely identify them as belonging to this group of people.
The names to me don't sound particularly Jewish or Hebrew.
Not necessarily, also deliberately in many cases not, because they wanted to say, we are Christians. So in fact, we don't see any religious deviance in the sources. These people were Christians, they were not Jews, but the memory that they, hundreds of years ago, had Jewish ancestor still persisted.
So thinking on Spalato, in the late medieval period, the period you're researching, how big was Spalato? And how big was the community of New Christians?
For the region, it was a fairly big town, so some 5,000 to 6,000 inhabitants. And the New Christian community Well, I could identify safely around 125 individuals in Spalato between roughly 1480 and 1530. These are mostly men because the sources are mostly concerning trade. So if we take into account the general low visibility of women in these sources, and also that not all people are necessarily mentioned in the sources that I found or that still exist, I think we can say that it's like between maybe 100 and 200 people, so not very many. However, we have to think that in this town, the, let's say, commercial elites didn't number so much. So there are a couple of hundred people, if at all. So there, such a presence was quite remarkable. And to just give an example of the importance, in an import register of the port of Spalato, 2/3 of all the licenses granted for the imports of grain were given to these new Christians. So this shows how important they were for the town.
And I do remember reading from your papers that that part of Dalmatia had to import grain because the Ottomans had taken over all their hinterland. So they had no choice.
Exactly. And that also explains the importance of this grew, because the Ottoman incursions severely reduced the hinterlands that was available to these coastal towns for agriculture, and many people also fled from the hinterland to the coastal towns, and then also from these coastal towns on to Apulia or other places in Italy. So there was also a severe shortage of labor, and the only agricultural product that they produced in an amount that was sufficient for themselves was wine. But grain, they hardly produced any, and they were completely dependent on imports either from Albania, which was also to a great extent Venetian at that time, or from Greek islands under Venetian control, and also from Apulia and Sicily.
But not the Ottoman area.
Well, in some cases, in Albania, it overlaps a little bit, the Venetian and the Ottoman parts. And the Dalmatian towns also wanted the Venetians to allow them to import grain from Ottoman territories. In some cases, it was also granted because it was simply necessary. Also, the import from Sicily and Apulia was not necessarily something that the Venetians liked that much, because they wanted to control all the trade. They wanted all the trade to go through Venice and through its own territories. But they also saw that it was simply necessary to ship grain from these non-Venetian places to their possessions in Dalmatia.
Yes, I understand. It was a very practical question, but it really needed the politics to understand it. You've talked about grain being imported into Dalmatia and mentioned wine. Were they the only goods traded?
Well, we see that the new Christian merchants brought the grain from Apulia to Dalmatia, and in return, they would export especially horses and cloth from Dalmatia, and also other goods like wax or honey.
It's obvious that the family links between Apulia and Dalmatia were very, very strong. And they used family members as trading partners. Does this mean that the families usually got on? Does this mean there were no arguments between brothers? And does it also mean that non-family members were less trusted than your family members?
Well, you are right. Family ties were very important for the new Christians, especially since they also married mostly among each other. So again, this strong tendency towards endogamy. I can maybe give you an example of how this business cooperation worked. So the import registers of the port of Spalato show that a new Christian merchant in Spalato received the license to import grain. And this grain was usually shipped on the ship of a local Dalmatian captain who would also transport the grain of several merchants on one voyage at the same time. But then these licenses also record who loaded the grain onto the ship in the Apulian harbor. And this person was, in most cases, a direct relative of the merchant in Spalato, so a brother, a son, a father, or a cousin. In cases when it was not a direct relative, it was always another new Christian who, given the endogamy that I've mentioned, was very likely also a relative of that merchant. However, conducting business with each other always brings the potential of conflict. Conflict about money, about traded goods, and we also see that clearly in the sources. So in one case, two brothers of the Barisano family call their cousins their enemies in the conflict about some traded goods that their grandfather had traded with Florentine merchants several decades earlier. So on the one hand, we see that family ties were absolutely important and fundamental, but when doing business with each other, it could also lead to big conflicts, which is probably not something very unique to late medieval Apulia or Dalmatia.
No, definitely not. But you say they hardly ever traded with or employed non-New Christians. If there was a shortage of jobs, that would have upset people?
Well, I'm referring mostly to the direct involvement in the trade. So really the person who received the license or the person who loaded the grain. Also, we cannot imagine that they physically loaded the grain onto the ships. So for these tasks, it is very likely that they employed local people. We also see that they shipped the grain on the vessels of local Dalmatian captains. They were mostly Dalmatian, these captains. But so to say, the people standing at the important ends of the trade, they tended to be relatives or at least people from within the same community.
Yeah, you said they loaded the ships, so I'm imagining these guys with big sacks of grain on their back. No. They would have been the owners of the grain.
Exactly,
the traders of the grain. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense then. And trade within the family makes passing of money a lot easier.
Exactly, and it also avoids the potential issue of bringing in this accusation of being a secret Jew should a conflict then arise about the business that they conducted with each other. Because if they both came from that same community, they couldn't accuse each other of this issue just to discredit one another.
Yeah, that's a good point. You've talked a lot about import licenses, export licenses, but how did they merge the two legal codes between Dalmatia and Apulia?
Well, in general, we do not see any difficulty with the different legal codes of the Republic of Venice and the Kingdom of Naples. So the merchants would simply adapt to the local laws in the port they were in. And we also have to consider that this Adriatic space was a common legal, also linguistic space. So Italian, be it in the Venetian variant or in another dialect, was the lingua franca also among the merchants there. So the laws also developed along similar lines. So they weren't too different, we can say. In one case, however, New Christians in Spalato were accused of trying to introduce Apulian customs in Dalmatia. So this matter was concerning the procedure in case an appeal was still pending in a trial. So it was a procedural judicial matter. And it shows that the potential for conflict when people from two different jurisdictions worked together. One thing that was very important to make this cooperation work was the authentication of notarial acts and case files by the Venetian consul in Apulia. So that way both sides could be sure that a document was real and valid when it was copied in one place and then sent to the other. So there the distance was rather the bigger problem than the different legal codes.
So thinking on the legal side of trading, were the merchants able to access insurance, or did they self-insure? Did the families support each other if something went horribly wrong? How did that aspect of their trade and community work?
So in general, insurance as an institution existed in the Mediterranean and also the Adriatic Sea, and the Venetians were also pioneers of that. So it was possible to insure the merchandise before going on a maritime trade. And we also see that many merchants agreed on different things before they would go on a voyage because they knew the dangers in it. In fact, most of the testaments that we have from young men were written either because they were going to war or because they were going on a ship. Just as most of the testaments from young women were written because they were pregnant or, of course, acutely sick. But the insurance was quite well developed at that time in the late medieval and Renaissance period, which points to the sophistication of this maritime trade between Venice, Dalmatia, Apulia, the Ottoman Empire, Venetian islands of Crete, for instance. So there were quite some big distances with many dangers that required this insurance.
Yeah, it would, yes. We've looked quite a bit at the trade of the new Christians. I assume as they were living between two countries, they were involved in both countries in all sorts of other ways. How were they involved in the more civil life of Spalato?
Yes, so besides their business activities, they could also participate in the local administration through things like tax farming. So they would pay the commune a fixed amount of money in return for the right to collect a specific tax or tariff from the local population. And being able to do that implies quite some knowledge of the local circumstances. So that also points to their integration into the society. Moreover, we see that many of these new Christians are called in the sources with the legal term of habitatores, so inhabitants, which was a legal category. And some of them even received citizenship, which also implied specific rights and privileges, but also duties. And in the late 16th century, we also see that some members of the new Christian Baresano family are mentioned among the 30 most honorable citizens of Spalato, which made them eligible as official procurators of the non-noble population, which was a very important office in the town. So this also points to their integration, also to their prestige, to their wealth, because that was also a very important criteria to receive citizenship and public office. And next to that, we see them being appointed as arbitration judges in arbitration tribunals that were instituted ad hoc for specific conflicts. And being elected as an arbitration judge also requires a certain amount of prestige, of expert knowledge in a certain field. So for the new Christians, it was mostly maritime trade. So if the conflict was about maritime trade, very often a new Christian would be appointed as arbitration judge. In addition to that, some of them were appointed as procurators in for different legal issues, legal contracts, again that required prestige and legal knowledge. And another important economic activity they engaged with was contracting maids and servants in Dalmatia, both for their households and fields in Dalmatia and for their relatives in Apulia. So they would contract a male servant or a female maid very often children, so they would be younger than 12, in some cases 6, 7, 8 years old. And they would then work on the fields in Dalmatia or on the house, in Dalmatia or Apulia or in the households. And the girls usually would work until they reached the age to be married, and then their employer would pay their dowry as part of their wage.
But it sounds like they're so integrated, and yet they were still a distinct community. I'm finding this absolutely amazing. How did they retain that distinct community while almost merging into the upper elite?
That is the important question that is very difficult to answer also. Did they want to stay different, or was it something that they couldn't change? So maybe to explain a bit more what I mean when I say that they stayed different and that their Jewish background was remembered, they were not openly referred to or called New Christians or Marani or Crypto-Jews or whatever in the first few decades of their being in Spalato. So there I find no trace of this in the sources until 1577. So in 1577, 2 members of the New Christian Baresano family were accused of murder. And their opponents, however, did not have enough evidence to prove that they had actually committed the murder. And so they searched for another way to discredit them and eventually ban them from Spalato. And the files of this trial are preserved in the Venetian State Archive, and they contain an anonymous denunciation that describes the whole Baresano family as blasphemous crypto-Jews. And this denunciation describes in details how members of the family allegedly spit out and crushed the Eucharist in a mortar, how they crucified a lamb on a cross to mock the crucifixion of Christ, how they went to Thessaloniki in the Ottoman Empire to revert to Judaism and become a rabbi, how they ate meat during Lent and observed the Shabbat, and even that they walked like Jews and Marani, whatever exactly that was supposed to be. So we see here a whole list of stereotypical accusations that were brought forward against Jews and converts in many places from the Middle Ages to modern times. None of that was, of course, true. So there is no evidence whatsoever in the sources of any actual religious deviance, neither in Apulia nor in Dalmatia. But what is so interesting about this source is that it was possible to bring forward these accusations against the Baresano family, and that they were plausible enough for the Venetian governor to act on them. And he confiscated the possessions of the family and banned them from Spalato. The Venetian courts then revoked this decision of the governor, however, rather because of procedural issues. And sources from the Vatican Apostolic Archive also show that the Catholic Church in Rome got involved because this was a matter of faith and apostasy. In the end, the Baresanos could return to Spalato and resume their position among the most prominent merchant families of the town. But this trial and the accusations of Judaizing show that the memory of the New Christians' Jewish background persisted, and it could be weaponized in a trial where it was plausible enough for the governor to act on it. And this persistence of the Jewish otherness, despite decades of successful integration, is quite remarkable, I would say.
It is completely remarkable. And earlier you said that Jews were discriminated against and expelled in times of stress. And here again, there is that example of the Jews being pointed out as Jewish, they were Christian, in a time of stress when they were being accused of murder.
Exactly.
And of course, they were rich.
Exactly. So we don't know the exact background of the conflict, But it is very likely that the family that accused them of murder envied them, they wanted to get rid of them, they were the competitors, both on a social and on a financial level. And we also see that this family was actually a family of problem makers in the towns. For decades, I've traced them through the sources, and they are always the first to go to trial, to accuse people, to make a scene. So they were real troublemakers, and in that case, they saw that they had the opportunity to discredit their opponents with these religious accusations that just reproduced the stereotypes of what Jews allegedly did, and converts when they were Judaizing. Although they try to be quite specific and really say that person did this and that, because usually these accusations are very general and just say they are Jews and do not go into details. But here they really tried and said it was Evangelista de Barisano who wanted to become a rabbi. It was Melio de Barisano who crushed the Eucharist in a mortar. But what is also telling is that the denunciation remained anonymous. So they sort of tried to hide behind it. But still, it was possible to bring forward these claims.
That's really interesting, how a prejudice can last for generations.
Exactly. Although we have seen in the sources that for decades, none of this was ever mentioned.
No.
But somehow the memory of it stayed, and people knew about it, and then they could weaponize it.
Yeah, yes, that is bad news. Not good. For my last question, Lena, as I know we're running out of time, do you think this group of new Christians could ever fully integrate and just disappear? And do you think they would want to?
This is very difficult to tell. I mean, I would say yes, but the problem is that the sources in general tend to record only conflict. So what we know about are the conflicts, the crisis when something goes wrong, whereas when there is no problem, when people live side by side peacefully, there was no need to write a source about it. So we also don't know if at the time that these accusations against the Barisano family were brought forward, whether it would have been possible to bring forward these accusations against another family of new Christians in Split, or if for some reason the Barisano maintained a higher degree of otherness than other families. But we also see that the new Christians married local people. However, here I have to say that again the sources are a bit tricky, because it is very difficult to tell what the origin, the birth family of a woman was once she was married, because then she's only described as the wife of her husband. So there might even be more marriages between new Christians and local Spalatins than we can for sure know of from the sources. So I do think that it was possible to disappear, to integrate completely into the local society. But again, it's difficult to tell from the sources.
Yeah. I think having spent 20 years of my life living outside my own country, I know it is difficult to integrate, but it's so good when you do.
It is, yeah. And we also mustn't forget that in Dalmatia, language also played a role. So Italian and Latin might have been the languages of trade and of administration, but the language that was spoken on the streets was Slavic, so the local Western South Slavic language. To what extent the new Christians learned that language is also difficult to tell, because the sources do not really write about what people spoke, but we can assume that at least the children born there must have known it in order to really live in that society.
Yeah, their nursemaids would have been local.
Yes.
And on that interesting note, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Lena, as we've run out of time. Thank you so much for coming in and talking today to me and to the Meeson audience for the Meeson podcast. It's been really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to present this research.
Today I've been talking with Lena Sadovski about her research into the persistence of Jewish otherness amongst the new Christians of Spalato, integration, persecution and trade. My thanks to everyone for listening. I hope you found it as interesting and informative as I did. Please do look out for the next Meeson podcast in which Meeson members and associates talk about their recent or ongoing research into the medieval world of Central Europe. And if you have research that you or your colleagues are doing and you'd like to talk about it to Meeson, please do contact me through the Meeson board or the CEU Department of Historical Studies. I'm Karen Culver for the Meeson podcast. Thank you and goodbye until the next time.